Let's go back to that issue that I started with at the top of the show, the Northern Territory's report out today, 180 pages from the Treaty Commissioner Tony McAvoy, that risks turning the Northern Territory into a series of micro-states or mini-nations. I think it's extraordinary, and you don't have to look far to see where this could all end. Look at New Zealand, where Maori interests are now robbing them of crucial democratic safeguards. Joining me now to talk through what's actually proposed and what it means for all Australians is John Roskam from the Institute of Public Affairs. Well, John, it's almost every day now we're talking about making a treaty with ourselves. Yes, at a Commonwealth level, now the states, but of course this plan for the Northern Territory is much bigger than all of that. And this idea that basically township communities in the NT would be their own little nations, this is not reconciliation. No,
exactly as you said, Peter, it's dividing us, and we need to understand there are national consequences of this, because this is one of the very first things Anthony Albanese said he would do. Mm-hmm. This is the implication of treaty making, exactly as you say. It's basically the establishment of microstates, mm-hmm. separate countries, under the guise of sovereignty, that is dividing Australians permanently. And one of the things that strikes me about what's happening, and it's now happening in Victoria as well, is the very low level of media scrutiny. We have to understand the federal government is in support of this. Mm-hmm. The federal coalition doesn't yet have a position. Most of the media is in support. Civil society, big business is in support of this. And there's no discussion as to what this actually means on the ground, and as you say, whether it's good for the country or not. You're right to point to the fact that there's not enough information in the debate, and I get a sense that Anthony Albanese, and I referenced Paul Kelly's column in The Australian last night, is almost wanting to push this on to a referendum issue before we wake up to what's really proposed. But in the report today regarding the Northern Territory, we're talking about these micro-states that will then decide education, hospital services, roads, all the things that we elect governments to do. But of course, unlike states and a national government that raises its own revenue from its people, it won't be raising revenue from the communities that it'll govern. They'll still expect the same money to come from Canberra, the same money to come from Darwin, but the people elected who are paying those taxes in those jurisdictions will have no say how it's spent. So how do you avoid a situation where we're paying the bills, but we're not getting the outcomes that this is all supposed to drive in remote communities? Well, exactly. We're not getting the outcomes, and there's no democratic accountability. Now, what this doesn't appreciate is Australians want to build on the goodwill of the entire community, but mm-hmm. this sort of separatism mm-hmm. divides our democracy. And exactly as you say, the funding from one part of Australia to another part of Australia that basically regards itself as self-governing, doesn't provide for democratic control, doesn't provide outcomes, and it divides us and it erodes that goodwill that we can all work together to solve disadvantage. And we've got this in Victoria too. We've got this Uruk Commission, it's called. It comes from the First Peoples Assembly. They've established this body. They were due to put a report into the government, to the governor specifically, but they've been asked to delay it because there's a lot of concerns about the governance model and other things that are proposed. And of course, related to all of this, we have this debate in the Victorian Parliament last week. The coalition doesn't put a different view out there other than Tim Smith. They've accepted the line about a treaty, but it won't be the Parliament that formulates the treaty. Like we see federally, it's actually a new body created at arm's length and independent of the government without having elected people on it that will sit down and determine the treaty, this truth-telling rubbish about what happened in Australia 3 centuries ago, and likely reparations payments as well. And it will bind our democratically elected MPs. This undermines the notion of democracy. This undermines the notion that we can all move together as a single community. And exactly as you say, this is already riven by politics. We have a $40 million organisation engaged in consultations. Now, there's reports that at some meetings, some consultations, there were 3 or 4 elders who turned up and something like 20 public servants. This is not about practical outcomes. It's not about overcoming disadvantage. It's about politics. It's about jobs. The idea that basically only Indigenous Victorians can be employed by these organisations is an anathema to nearly every Australian. This is about politics, not about practical solutions.
So how did we get here, John? Because we're about the same age, right? And I remember the very early days of the reconciliation debate and an enormous...
Which was positive.
Enormous goodwill in the Australian community. And I think a real determination that we would move on from the times of the past and that there would be a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood. And we now, I think, should be celebrating the fact that we've got 11 Aboriginal people in the parliament.
Yep.
In percentage terms, a lot bigger than we've got in the Australian population. I think that is a wonderful thing. Hardly anyone in the media is talking about that. They're talking about all these ways that we're going to define ourselves. It feels like this has come from nowhere. I know it's been an undercurrent. I know the activists have pushed it. But out there in the real world, I think Australians feel like they're just waking up to this. And it's like, where has this come from? And how on earth can we wind it back?
It's been a process. We had the success of the 67 referendum. Mm-hmm. We had Mabo, which by and large has been a success. But there is huge frustration that for the billions of dollars that we're spending and the goodwill, we are still not getting outcomes. And it's a lot easier to engage in politics than to do the hard work on health and education. And as Peter, you and I have spoken about on a range of matters, Australians have taken the rule of law for granted. We have taken it for granted that our MPs are going to be responsible to us. We have allowed here in Victoria a separate justice system to evolve. At various stages, we haven't said, look, is this the right way to go? I have the utmost respect for the flag, but even the idea that now we have two flags, for me, represents the idea we have two communities. We don't have one community. We are one Australian people.
Noel Pearson calls it the tyranny of low expectations, that we tolerate in these remote Aboriginal communities what we wouldn't tolerate anywhere else in Australia. And part of my concern, and this is a cynical view, but I've been around a long time, is that there is almost a vested interest in this Aboriginal activist class who actually don't want that disadvantage to change. They actually don't want things to be fixed because there goes their business model.
And it's hard. And you listen to a great Australian like Jacinta Price, and she talks about this has to be done gradually, carefully, and it's difficult. The plague of alcoholism, the plague of drug abuse in Indigenous communities is something that is not going to be fixed by playing politics in Sydney or Melbourne and Canberra. But it's a lot easier to do that than to talk about how we get kids into school, for example. And basically what we've seen is now an avoidance of the challenges, and we're talking about a treaty when we've still got Indigenous young Australians not in schools. We have got it completely the wrong way around.
All right, John Roskam, we'll come back to this issue, I'm sure, many times over. Thank you. Keep up the fight at the IPA on this issue too.